Hi folks, I'm really so pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you today. I do want to share some information with you. I'm going to focus specifically on disposal issues related to African swine fever, and I'm going to share some tools that we've recently developed to hopefully make your jobs easier if you're having to choose options and come up with a plan for an infected premises. So there's two tools that we've recently published. One is an African swine fever summary chart. Although it says disposal here on the slide, it really covers depopulation, disposal, and decontamination. And we created it at the request of a colleague at the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture. I had given a lengthier talk about current research and how it supports decision making during an ASF outbreak. And he said, I keep referring back to your PowerPoint to look at the articles that you reference and the data that comes out of it. Do you have like a summary of that? So that's where this came from. I also want to talk to you about the Carcass Management Dashboard, which is intended to help folks come up with a site-specific disposal plan. And also that dashboard, that website has all of the articles, reports, and documents that we've generated over the past 10 years or so to improve our capabilities. So in terms of the summary chart, this is just a glimpse that I'm sure you can't read of the one section of the disposal part. And this document is available in PDF. It is on the website dashboard. I'm happy to I will be uploading the PDF version. Right now it's an Excel spreadsheet, but I'm happy to send it to you, or you can find it at the website. So it goes through various disposal options, applicability, effectiveness, and limitations, and then references to articles that would support that information. So as an example, the burial option is listed as applicable if it is allowed for environmental reasons. In the land of 10,000 lakes, quite often it's not going to be available. And also effectiveness, limitations of the option, as well as references to articles. So I'm sorry, the burial option, if it were possible to do at a location based on the depth to groundwater, and for regulatory approvals, then it does get the waste material out of sight, maybe not so much out of mind. Once it's buried in the subsurface, very little decomposition occurs because at 6 to 12 feet below the ground surface, there are not many microorganisms to break things down. And so we've found, farmers might have a burial site and then their property goes for development 50 years later, and we find the burial sites looking just like they were created the day before. And also, in recent outbreaks, we've had people coin the term burial remorse. So those who have done it are sorry for a variety of reasons. But sometimes it's appropriate, and we have checklists that you can go through to figure that out. And I'll show you how to get to those. Next, I want to tell you about the Carcass Management Dashboard. But before we go into that, I just wanted to run through the various disposal options that are related to the dashboard. And the information is summarized. It might be useful to you on its own. So there are 6 standard carcass management options. The off-site options would be incineration, landfill, and rendering. The on-site options being burning, burial, and composting. We have an innovative option that shows a lot of promise, but we're still trying to validate it. And it's called above-ground burial, which is a combination of composting and shallow burial. And then there's some related activities like storage and transport as well. So in terms of incineration, it involves packaging infected carcasses into barrels or boxes, as you can see on that far left photo. In the second photo, the Gaylord box, as it's called, is being loaded into a truck. The boxes are about a cubic yard, so 3 by 3 by 3 or so. So the idea of packaging swine into a 3 by 3 by 3 box is kind of daunting. But, you know, it could be applicable for smaller animals or what have you. The great thing about incineration is that it heats the material to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, so it kills everything. The bad news is there aren't that many plants around, and so you might have to travel quite a distance to get there. So overall, it takes a moderate amount of time and is low risk, but potentially high cost due to travel reasons. In terms of landfilling, that involves transporting carcasses to a permitted landfill, which is designed to collect leachate, manage methane gas that's produced, and so it is designed to be safe. They're readily available, landfills, you know, all over the country. It's quick to implement and can often accommodate a large amount of waste / carcasses. And if the landfill leachate is treated before discharge, like through a municipal wastewater treatment plant, there's virtually no risk of viruses surviving those processes and getting to a susceptible host. But landfill companies may not be willing to accept carcasses due to perception, fear that they might spread the virus, their brand protection even. So one thing we've been talking about with them is the idea of if you have an infected premises, let's say there's 10 barns on the premises, one of them has come up positive, the other 9 are not. They're dangerous contacts, but they're not currently positive, especially if we have lab data to support that. Landfills have indicated they would take non-infected material from an infected premises or a control zone if we sign the profile that says, you know, it's not infected. So that's one option. Again, during the heat of the outbreak may not play out as well as we hope, even with advance agreements with the landfills, but it's definitely an option that is worth spending a good bit of time pursuing. Rendering involves transporting carcasses to a rendering plant where the carcasses are ground and heated, driving off 60% of the biomass as a steam or water portion. 20% is fat or tallow, which can be used as a biodiesel, and the remaining 20% is a meat or bone meal, which is typically used in pet food and animal feed. Renderers do not want any perception of contamination in their premium pet foods. So there's a lot of concern about renderers being able to take material from an infected premises, even from a control zone. Those rendering plants or companies who export their products say they're not even allowed to drive through a control zone. So that could be a big challenge. We are currently working with the National Renderers Association, and we have a survey out to their members right now to explore different scenarios where they would be willing to take infected material or even non-infected material from a control zone. And that is most likely to occur if the rendering plant is in the control zone. So we're hoping to quantify that. We should have results from the survey in the next week or two. So overall, rendering is quick and moderate cost, but poses a high risk to the rendering operation if consumers won't buy their products. Burning is the first of our on-site options, and it's commonly used internationally for African swine fever. I was invited to the Ukraine to participate in a workshop just about this time last year where we shared lessons learned from the U.S. side in terms of what we were working on to address a potential ASF outbreak, and to learn from Eastern European countries what they have been experiencing from active ASF outbreak right now. And they wanted to get away from open burning. That's what they were doing, and they wanted to get away from it. Unfortunately, ASF is a really huge challenge, and we don't have a lot of answers. What I've got is bits of data that I'm have put together in one place, which will hopefully help people make decisions, but we still have a lot of work to do. Incineration, open pyre. I've shown different kinds here. So you've got the air curtain, so this is the open pyre, the air curtain incinerator in a trench, air curtain in a box, and then mobile crematoria. Typically we're talking about the open pyre for international use. We may be more inclined to use the air curtain, but they have similar human health risks and cost. So although on-farm burning can reduce transport costs and risks, it does pose a human health concern. So it inactivates a virus, reduces the waste volume down to 5% of the original volume, and it could be a possible alternative. However, in 2001, during the UK FMD outbreak, they estimated that every pig that was burned emitted 6.5 pounds of particulate matter. And particulates are associated with asthma and human respiratory problems. Overall, burning takes a moderate amount of time, has a relatively high cost, and has moderate risks to humans and animals. Burial involves excavating unlined trenches or pits 6 to 12 feet below the ground surface. It's often the first option people in the U.S. think of for disposal, but studies have shown there is a risk of groundwater pollution from chemicals and the virus unless soils are suitable, and burial also limits future land use. So as an example, when the carcasses are buried at depth, although the tissue doesn't break down, there is an initial release of liquids in the form of leachate. That leachate contains very high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus, and if you have the right soils with the right distance to groundwater, with the right distance to a residential drinking water well, those levels of nitrogen are 2,000 to 4,000 times higher than the safe limit for human consumption, and that high level of nitrogen could be fatal to infants. So it is a real issue, and there is also a single study that was done during HiPath AI in Wisconsin that found viable HiPath AI virus about a week after the premises was identified as positive, and it survived in groundwater beneath the site. So how long it would continue to survive, samples that were taken later than that, maybe 2-3 weeks out, did not have viable virus. We don't know if that's because the virus had moved on down the pipeline or if it was because the virus was no longer active. Okay, so burial potentially limits future land use. Some states require that the property deed be amended to indicate that there's a burial site on the property. It is quick and cheap, but may have high risks. Composting involves placing carcasses on a 1-foot layer of wood chips, covering the carcasses with another foot or so of wood chips or similar material. It's very effective. It gets hot, upwards of 140 degrees Fahrenheit or more. Can be done on farm. And is relatively easy to implement. However, composting whole adult swine carcasses can take up to a year before they fully decompose, and the compost is quote-unquote finished, so to be released from quarantine. And at that 1-year point, it's not unusual to find large bone fragments left in the compost pile. So they've been heated up, but you still have like femurs, and the question is, do those femurs, does the bone marrow in the femurs still have viable virus in it? So we're currently doing a study with Oklahoma to look at that, and we're also looking at the possibility of grinding carcasses before composting, and I'll go into those a little more in a minute. Overall, composting takes a moderate amount of time to implement. It's relatively expensive because of the carbon source and the expertise that's needed to do it properly, but it has low risk to human, animal, and environmental health. And it was used on 85% of the carcasses, the 50 million birds in HiPath AI 2015. And finally, above ground burial is sort of a cross between shallow burial and composting. It's about a 2-foot deep trench dug into the soil with about a foot of wood chips or other carbonaceous material. The carcasses are placed on top. The soil from the trench is placed over the top, and then the surface is seeded with an appropriate vegetation. It also could take about a year for the carcasses to fully break down, and some work that's been done on large swine in Virginia found that the abdomens had to be opened, or the fatty skin layers would not break down or even allow the carcass itself to break down very well. So it could be quite labor intensive for whole carcasses, and to have a production facility with a compost pile that can't be released for a year could be really problematic. Maybe centralized location where it's not a farm where composting is done on a large scale, that's an option that might be useful. Like closed landfills are a consideration, where they might have a lot of space and you could set up a composting operation there, or even open landfills often have compost, like yard waste composting. And so trying to have partnerships with landfills, even if they're not landfilling the waste, but to help with composting might be a good alternative. In terms of above ground burial, it is done on farm. It's easy to implement. So it has the advantages of burial in being fast and cheap. It is more protective of the environment than burial, but does not heat up like composting. So we're currently doing these validation studies to determine how well that is going to perform. Oops. And overall, it takes moderate time and is relatively inexpensive, but again, until it's fully validated, we consider it to be moderately high risk. So all of this talk of time, cost, and risk was to put it all together in sort of this graphical, quick glance guide, and just, really rough qualification of, is it high, medium, or low. So overall, landfill it's quick, cheap, and low risk. So overall, it appears to be the best option. Composting is on its heels, the worst option being open burning due to the human health risks and cost. But, the decision isn't just based on time, cost, and risk. Of course, it's public perception and political issues and all sorts of other things. In terms of temporary carcass storage considerations, this is an important aspect because if depopulation occurs faster than the ability to manage the carcasses, you're going to have a period of time where those unaddressed carcasses are still high in virus and open to scavengers and insect activity to potentially spread the virus. So it's a very crucial portion of the process. And so if depopulation rate exceeds the carcass management rate, then you need to address the storage concerns, which are liquids leaching from the piles, attracting scavengers and insects and so forth, odors. So to mitigate those risks, you want to contain the liquids. One way of doing that might be to place the carcasses on a foot or so of carbon material or putting some sort of absorbent material around the piles, covering the piles either with tarps or more carbon material. And for those places in the country where carbon material is available, it is compatible with all the disposal options except rendering. And then finally, carcass transport considerations. A few years ago, a fabulous risk assessment was performed by the University of Minnesota by our very own Dr. Goldsmith, where it was found that FMD-infected carcasses could be safely transported with lined, leak-resistant vehicles covered with a tarp, so looking something like that picture on the slide there. And if that securely tarped and maintained vehicle went down the road past healthy, susceptible herds, there was a very low risk of spreading FMD virus. And so pointing to that study to say the likelihood of ASF being transmitted by this route is also very low. And we used this protocol in HiPath AI with no additional outbreaks. Of course, there could be many factors to that, but it has worked before. Okay. And the last thing I wanted to touch on in terms of managing the carcasses is pre-treatment. So because composting or above ground burial of whole carcasses takes a long time and there are concerns about active virus in femurs, the question is, can the carcasses be ground first? Will that speed composting? Will it help with above ground burial? But will it also, can it be done safely without the grinding process creating aerosols that might spread disease? So we're currently working on a study in North Carolina. We're looking at grinder systems. We looked at different types of grinders at first. There's a tub grinder on the left there and a horizontal grinder on the right. The tub grinders can take 5 or 10 pig carcasses in a batch, processes them quickly, but then the tub has to be emptied. As opposed to the horizontal grinder, which works on a conveyor system so that the carcasses can be continuously loaded and it's more efficient. So we're only focusing on the horizontal grinders. And just to note, this isn't something that you would rent at your local Home Depot. These are huge tree grinders, 500 to 1,000 horsepower, that would be used in the logging industry or Forest Service, something like that. Just as a point of reference, in the state of North Carolina, there are about 10 or 20 of the 1,000 horsepower grinders available in the state for rent, but there are over 100 of 500 horsepower units available for rent in just the state of North Carolina. So they're pretty widely available. So our study has 4 objectives. One is to test the grinders and develop a protocol of best practices. So that would be, how can we get them to process 60,000 pounds an hour of swine carcasses? And that was estimated with our partners in industry to be about what they could generate during an outbreak. We're writing a protocol of those best practices so that it can be replicated elsewhere, and it would also include whatever mitigations would be needed for air emissions. The second objective was to evaluate the effect of grinding on composting and above ground burial. 3, to quantify the air emissions to determine if it is in fact a risk. And 4, to take the opportunity of doing these demonstration projects to train people on the grinder, composting, and above ground burial. And this is a train the trainer course, primarily geared for producers, but also state and federal responders are attending. And it's this week in Clinton, North Carolina. So the first trial we did, this was a 1,000 horsepower unit back in February, and we were able to process about 60,000 pounds of material in an hour. So for every pound of carcass, we also had a pound of wood chips. We tried it with the wood chips, without the wood chips, and we found that a 1-to-1 ratio made it run really well. And so that means the grinder was actually processing 120,000 pounds of material an hour. So if that gives you any idea of the size of these things. We then composted the ground material, and we collected soil samples underneath where the compost piles were going to be placed, and then after the composting was completed. We're awaiting the lab results. We also had air emissions tested. We enlisted the help of the US EPA that has a great research operation there in Raleigh, and they have been doing extensive air monitoring on the grinder equipment. What we saw during the first one in February was that cranking that 1,000 horsepower unit at full speed created a lot of emissions for quite a distance. Interestingly, we did look at the compost temperatures from those piles, and the ambient air temperatures were in the neighborhood of 45 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit during that month, from February to March. The compost temperatures were measured at depths of 18 and 36 inches into the piles, and within 2 weeks, both depths reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, based on the data points that we've assembled in that quick reference guide, it appears that that is sufficient to inactivate ASF virus. I'm not aware of any studies that have directly looked at ASF and composting with the actual virus. The trials 2 through 4, in July, we processed about 27,000 pounds of various size animals using a 500 horsepower grinder. We were able to achieve that same rate. So 60,000 pounds an hour is equivalent to about 1,200 pounds per minute. And we were able to achieve that with all subsequent trials. So July we did a 500 horse. Last month we did a 750 horsepower. And it was very effective. We modified the speed and sort of the way that the grinder was operated, and the emissions were much lower during the subsequent trials. We did monitor temperatures right after the July. I don't have all the data from August yet, my apologies. But just in the first couple days after the July effort, the whole carcasses increased to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit in 2 days, while the ground carcasses temperature rose to 120 to 140 within 2 days. So, that just tells you how the grinding expedites the process. It causes a much earlier and higher temperature increase in the compost piles, which supports the idea that it would speed composting. So instead of a producer having to wait a year, it would be more on the order of poultry or a month, which was successfully done in the 2015 outbreak. And then on to the carcass management dashboard. I promised to zip through this really quickly. I'm going to show you how to use the dashboard based on an average farm size of about 6,800 pigs. So this is located at on our APHIS website, and the address is up there. You could go here to the big box that says click here, but for the first time around, I would suggest going through the steps. You get to the same place whether you click there or there, but at least it walks you through it if you go through the step process. So you click on step 1, which opens this view. You would then click on step 1A, which is opening an options time and cost calculator, which brings up a spreadsheet that looks something like this. And what it gives you is an opportunity to enter your site-specific information in the blue boxes here. And so in our example, we have swine. Let's assume they're 300 pounds apiece, 6,800 of them. They were lost to a virus. Let's say the farm has 5 acres available where they could, bury or burn or compost or whatever. They also have access to 4 roll-off containers. They know where they could rent 4. They're 30 cubic yard containers, and they are some distance away from landfills, rendering, and incineration, but they don't know off the top of their heads exactly how far. So the user would download, save this Excel spreadsheet on their personal, computer, because we are not saving any data that's entered into this on the APHIS website. In order to save that, you would have to download it to your computer. You would go, so after you've saved it to your drive, you would go back to the dashboard and open the routing map under step 1B. And then you can enter a location, and you may see a bunch of dots all over this map. And those dots are: blue is landfills, R is rendering plants, and every once in a while you might spot a green I for incinerator. There's also a table at the bottom of the map, and this table would have a list of every facility, landfill, rendering, and incinerator on that map. It would include a contact name and phone number, address, and you can contact those folks. But anyway, so you enter your location, and I just randomly chose Lincoln, Nebraska. And it zooms in, and you want to adjust your zoom so you've got some facilities in there. And then you can drop a pin at the premises and another pin on the nearest landfill, and it will give you the distance. And so you want to note that distance because you're going to need that to enter back into the spreadsheet you just saved. You'll repeat that process for rendering and incineration. Enter it into the calculator, and it returns output. This output is what you'll want to use to help you decide what to put in your plan, your site-specific disposal plan. So one thing you might want to look at quickly is this graph, and it is time and cost, time being blue bars, cost being green, on-site options on the left, off-site options on the right. Presumably you want to keep the carcasses on farm if possible, so you'll start looking at the 4 on the left. I see right off that open burning one is crazy, time-consuming, and expensive, so I'm going to disregard that for now. I'm going to focus on those other 3. Above ground burial comes out really well, but it's still innovative. Maybe I'm not going to do that one. So let me look at on-site burial and composting. So I'm going to look at the graph, the tabular section. On-site options are on the left, and it includes information like how many acres you need for composting. This is 1.53. You have 5 acres available, so that's great. If you didn't have enough acreage, then this would show up in red. It tells you how much carbon source you would need and also estimates the cost. Similarly, for burial, it estimates the space you would need, the amount of time it would take, so it's less than a day to bury 800. And this is based on excruciatingly detailed data, which is part of the calculator. So when you download it, it has multiple tabs, and if you really cared to go into the details, you could go into the the assumptions and equations tabs and see how these numbers were derived. So you'd use that to plug into a site-specific plan. We've put a template under step 2 on this dashboard. You can pull up the template and figure out if composting and burial in our example are going to work for you. And you would use these checklists and planning guides to help you. The template enables you to fill in basic information about the farm, to determine if for composting, is your site suitable for composting or not. You would use the checklist to figure that out. And note that pretty much the first step on the checklist is to check with your local your state environmental regulator to find out if composting is even allowed. And then you would go on through, and you already know you have enough space, and you'd go on through and figure out how far you are from sensitive waterways and whatnot to see if it would work. And then you would use those other planning guides and protocols to fill out like the equipment you would need. So if you wanted to do composting, you might need skid steers. You would contact local rental companies to find out who has them and would be willing to rent them to you, have their name and contact information so that you could get it in a hurry. And same thing for carbon source. It's very important for composting. These are examples of sort of the lists you get from the planning guides and composting protocol. And just to let you know that the dashboard has much more than just that that site-specific disposal plan stuff. It's got research articles, training, courses, other tools and resources. So we hope you can visit this site, look at the ASF summary guide, look at the dashboard, see if you think it's helpful and how it could be improved, and let us know. It would be really great.